All right, well, on that note, let's get started. So, hello everyone. My name is Tristan Bradshaw. I co-direct this Critical Antiquities Network with Ben Brown. And on behalf of Ben and I want to welcome you to the Critical Antiquities Workshop today. It's great to have you. I want to begin just by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that the University of Sydney is located on. And I want to pay respects to its elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that the land was stolen when European colonisers came, and the consequences of this injustice are still evident and deeply felt today. And I also want to say that for a group of people that value engaging with ancient past for thinking about the present, it's apt that the Critical Antiquities Network is based in Australia, home to the oldest continuing living civilizations on Earth. But for today, we're going to have to settle for the young upstarts that we call the ancient Greeks, because the two books that feature today take ancient Greek philosophy as their point of departure for an intervention into contemporary philosophical and theoretical and political debates. So before I get to our presenters, I'll just talk a little bit about the format for today. There are going to be roughly 3 parts to it. In the first part, we'll discuss Michael Della Rocca's book, The Parmenidean Ascent, and we'll have commentary by Michael, who will introduce it for the first little bit, and then André Lax and Dimitry Vardalakis will present some pre-prepared comments. Following that, we'll have Dimitry Vardalakis introduce his book, and we'll have Russ Leo and Michael Della Rocca present some pre-prepared comments on that. And then finally, we'll turn to questions and open discussion. Just some protocols for the questions. If you could hold off writing questions in the chat function until after the presenters have all presented their pre-prepared comments, that would be great. Just that way we won't lose the questions up the chat. So please do put your questions in the chat once the formal presentations have concluded. And you can either write your question there and ask me to read it for you, or you can just put a Q in the chat and I'll call you as is when it's time, I think they're the only 2 options, right? Without any further ado, just like to introduce briefly Michael Della Rocca, and I've warned the presenters today that I will be just giving them short introductions, not for a lack of things to mention, the accolades to mention about them, but rather because of the wealth of accolades, I wanted to minimize the formalities so that we can get to the wealth of material that we have in front of us today. So let me quickly just introduce Michael. Michael Della Rocca is the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. He principally works on the history of modern philosophy, metaphysics, and the philosophy of mind, and he's a widely recognized expert on the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. But we're delighted that he's taken his interest in monism in particular to Parmenides, and has this wonderful book, The Parmenidean Ascent, that we're able to engage with today. So let me hand it over to Michael to introduce his book for us.
Thank you, Tristan, and thank you for organizing the event. You and Ben and the others, I really was delighted when this idea came forward, and I jumped at the chance to be part of this session. And this is the first occasion to talk about my book in public since it's been published. It was just published over the summer. And it was a book I've been working on for many years. And one thing I take pride in about the book is that I hardly mention Spinoza at all in the book. I've published a lot on Spinoza, but I wanted to write a book that was not about Spinoza, at least not explicitly, although he's in the background for a lot of the book. And I think that'll become apparent in some of the exchanges with Dimitri today. So this is my foray into contemporary philosophy, but also into ancient philosophy as well. If you haven't seen the book, this is the book. The cover, actually, the cover, you can tell this book by its cover, actually. So maybe I'll have more to say about the cover later. It's just a blank white cover with just the title here, and there's a story behind the way that's written too. But let me give a summary, a very brief summary of the book, and then we'll have André's comments and Dimitri's comments. There are three big themes in the book, okay? And all these, I think, are in one way or another Parmenidean themes, and also Spinozistic themes too, although that's not explicit. The first theme is monism, which I've written a lot about, but here I mean something very specific, a very radical form of monism, where there are no distinctions, no multiplicity whatsoever. This is much stronger than the views that are currently being discussed in contemporary metaphysics that go by the name of monism. Jonathan Schaffer's priority monism is a wonderful view, but it's far too weak a monism for my taste. I call Schaffer's priority monism, which is where there's only one fundamental thing, which is the whole world, but there's lots of multiplicity within it, lots of distinctions within it. That's a way too tame a monism for me. I call that priority monism, monism for babies. It's good, but it's a starter monism. You can start out your monism with that, and to get to a more radical form of monism, which is the one that I'm sort of espousing in my book. So by monism, I just mean the view that there are no distinctions whatsoever. And it's not actually a numerical monism. I don't quite, it's actually misleading to call it monism, because I'm not saying there's one thing, because perhaps to say that there's one thing presupposes the intelligibility of there being many, and I don't want to presuppose even the intelligibility of there being many. So it's not necessarily a monism in the sense of a numerical monism, just in the sense of there being no distinctions. The other theme, another theme, is rationalism, of course, which is something I've written on a lot too. And by rationalism here, I just mean a commitment to the principle of sufficient reason, the principle according to which each thing that exists has an explanation, or each fact has an explanation. And here I mean a very strong form of the PSR, stronger than you get in, for example, Kant I think Kant is a very watered down version of the PSR. He likes it, but he thinks, as many of you know, I'm sure, he thinks it doesn't apply in certain areas. For me, the PSR is all or nothing, as it were. And so it's a much stronger form of the PSR than you find in Kant, a much stronger form than you find in contemporary metaphysics. For example, in Shamik Dasgupta's wonderful paper called Metaphysical Rationalism, here's a kind of a watered down version of the PSR. And I want to defend a stronger version of that, where absolutely every fact or everything that exists, if there are such things, has an explanation. I think this stronger form of monism is at work in Spinoza. I think it's also at work in Bradley, and that's part of the theme of the book. It's also, I think, something appreciated by Hume. Hume, of course, rejects the PSR, but for me, for Bradley, for Spinoza, and for Hume, they see a certain kind of connection between the PSR and monism. All those philosophers believe that the PSR, in some stronger or weaker form, but the PSR in some form entails some form of monism. PSR entails monism. Hume sees that connection. Spinoza sees that connection. Bradley sees that connection. Hume, of course, rejects the PSR and rejects monism, because he rejects the PSR because he hates the monism, which he sees correctly that it implies. So it's like one philosopher's modus ponens is another philosopher's modus tollens. So Bradley and Spinoza like the PSR, and so they embrace the monism that it entails. Hume hates monism, so he rejects the PSR that entails that monism. So anyway, that's another theme, rationalism. And the final major theme is skepticism in the book. And again, it's a radical form of skepticism. It's not just the view that, well, we don't know whether tables and chairs or people exist. No, rather it's a skepticism that denies that our ordinary conceptions of things actually are coherent. So I'm denying the intelligibility of relations, the intelligibility of distinctions. And because such ordinary conceptions presuppose multiplicity, they presuppose distinctions, but distinctions are being ruled out by this monistic philosophy. Parmenides, he's not explicitly skeptical in the way that I think he is explicitly a rationalist, and he is explicitly a kind of monist. But I think he does say things that are skeptical in my sense, in the sense that he denies that our ordinary conceptions of things as involving distinctions, those ordinary conceptions of things, he denies that they're intelligible. Sextus is really more of a model for me in that aspect of the book, as is Bradley, who also embraces skepticism. Now, underlying all these themes in the book is, for me, it's a critique of the way that philosophy is done. And I wrote the book partly knowing that it would be polemical in a way, it'd be controversial, but I'm quite, want to be very upfront about this, that I think that much of the way that philosophy is done, especially nowadays, is really bankrupt in a certain way. And especially in certain quarters of analytical philosophy where there's lots of distinctions running rampant, I think, and there's other methodological problems there, I think there's a kind of emptiness in contemporary analytical philosophy. So I'm trained as an analytical philosopher. I still am an analytical philosopher, but I'm a renegade analytical philosopher. So I'm coming out of the closet, as it were, in this book, partly in this book, to show where I stand on that issue. What I want to do really, more generally, is to take down a certain kind of realist metaphysics and also a certain kind of style of philosophizing that is far too reliant on intuitions, whatever they may be, or common sense. That's really the methodology of so much of philosophy, especially nowadays, and especially among analytic metaphysicians, a reliance on common sense. And I think that methodology is what I find inherently conservative and stultifying in certain ways. Now, to start my rationalist train of thought in motion, this rationalist monist skeptical train of thought in motion, my general strategy is to look at certain pretty uncontroversial, I think, explanatory demands in various areas that are central to philosophy. So philosophy is in the business of seeking explanations of things, giving metaphysical explanations in some sense or other. It's what philosophers do. And they're asking the question, what is it in virtue of which a certain phenomenon attains? What is it in virtue of which a substance is a substance? What is it in virtue of which an action is an action? What is it in virtue of which a given case of knowledge is a case of knowledge? What is it in virtue of which a linguistic term or a sentence has meaning? What is in virtue of this meaning? I think these are all explanatory demands that are more or less explicitly driving large swaths of contemporary and historical philosophy. And I think that focusing on these explanatory demands, which really have a rationalist character, I think rationalism is much more pervasive than philosophers realize. By focusing on these explanatory demands, I want to show how lots of problems arise. So I give a story for each of the main chapters in the book of a given central area in philosophy: substance, action, knowledge, meaning, explanation itself. And I think they're all driven by a certain kind of explanatory demand, which is great. And historically and in contemporary philosophy, lots of philosophers criticize other philosophers for failing to meet that explanatory demand. Also great. That's a good basis for a criticism. Unfortunately, the sad story goes that in each case, the philosophers who are making those kinds of criticisms, and rightly so, of others for failing to meet the explanatory demand, themselves fail to meet the explanatory demand. They fall into the same kinds of problems that other philosophers are accused of falling into. And this is a pattern that's repeated again and again in the history of philosophy, I think. I begin one chapter, early chapter, by talking about the concept of substance, and I start with Aristotle, and I think he sees the value of the explanatory demand. He wants to say what it is that makes a substance, and he gives an answer, and ultimately he gives an answer, but that is, we can go into it if you want, I don't think we have time right now, but it's unsatisfactory because he appeals to the way in which form can unify matter into a substance, but he doesn't tell us how that unification occurs. So he leaves the crucial explanatory question unanswered, the failure to answer that how question. And Descartes and lots of later philosophers criticized Aristotle for this, and criticized their scholastic philosophers too, on precisely this point. And I think they were right to do so. And Descartes proposed his own theory of substance. Leibniz, in a characteristically ecumenical fashion, wanted to retain something of substantial forms and realized the failure of Aristotelian explanation in this regard. Leibniz himself had his own theory, but also failed to answer the crucial explanatory question. I go over in some detail how these failures occurred. And I think that there's a similar sad history in each of the main areas that I discuss: action, knowledge, meaning, all those areas. And I do get my hands dirty by looking both historically and at a range of contemporary views in these areas and showing that it's surprising, but it's true, that there's a same failure to meet the similar explanatory demands in all of these areas. And then I show that there's a reason behind this rampant failure. It's not a coincidence. It leads us to suspect that there's something wrong at the heart of all of these approaches. And I identify the culprit by appealing to a certain Bradleyan argument concerning relations. Because I think the source of the problem, and this is the a priori argument I give that drives a lot of the book, the source of the problem is that we appeal to a relational concept of substance, a relational concept of action, knowledge, and meaning. But the kinds of relations at the heart of these theories, they're all unintelligible for reasons that Bradley gives, and that I give in a way, a more elaborate version of a Bradleyan regress argument. I think I put it on better foundations, but it's an argument that challenges the reality of relations on the basis of the PSRs. This is kind of a rationalist argument against the reality of relations. And I developed that, and I use that to show why, just as we'd expect, all of these theories fail to meet their own explanatory aims. So I won't go over the details of the Bradleyan argument. I'm very happy to answer any questions about that argument. But I say that to save these notions that have been threatened in this way, the notion of substance, action, meaning, and knowledge, I said to save those notions, we must move to an undifferentiated, non-relational version of these concepts, of these phenomena. So we must move to undifferentiated being or substance, undifferentiated knowledge, undifferentiated action, undifferentiated meaning. We can capture reality better, I say, not by appealing to these differentiated versions of these phenomena, but by eliding the distinctions and embracing an undifferentiated version of knowledge, meaning, substance, being, etc. This rising above distinctions, this elision of distinctions, is what I call the Parmenidean Ascent. So if we're going to save the notion of meaning, knowledge, etc., or being itself, we must appeal to undifferentiated being. That's the PSR-driven kind of conclusion that I try to reach. I try to illustrate this by saying all is being, all is meaning, all is knowledge, all is action, and there is no differentiation within that. I give an analogy to God as Aquinas conceives God. Not that I have any kind of desire to resurrect Aquinas as God, but I really like the Aquinas' conception of God, because God is pure being for Aquinas. God is pure actuality. God is pure knowing for Aquinas, without any distinctions. There's a separate world that God creates for Aquinas, and that would involve distinctions. But God in itself, or in himself, or in itself, involves no distinction. It's pure being, pure action, pure knowing, pure meaning in a way too, for Aquinas. So it's as if I take an Aquinas view of God, and that is the extent of reality. That's the view. So that's this kind of monist view without any distinctions whatsoever. Then the view turns on itself, and I'm very upfront about this, because I think that the same challenge to relational substance or relational action, etc., also shows that there's a problem about metaphysical explanation itself. I've used metaphysical explanations in making the explanatory demand in virtue of what? What explains why a substance is a substance? That's to appeal to a notion of metaphysical explanation. And I used a Bradleyan critique against the notion of substance, being, action, and meaning, and that's fine. But the notion of metaphysical explanation itself involves relations, and thus comes under the attack of the very Bradleyan argument that I used against those other notions like substance, meaning, knowledge, and action, that applies to the notion of metaphysical explanation itself. lots of ways in which I show that here. So this whole project, as it were, and undermines itself, because the challenge that I raised to all these other notions before making my Parmenidean Ascent with regard to those notions applies to the notion of explanation itself. So the view undermines itself. We're left with all is explanation too, but it's a view that's in a way impossible to coherently state. And that's something that I embrace. And so what's going on here is a kind of Wittgensteinian move, kicking away the ladder as Wittgenstein does at the end of the Tractatus. Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus, he has this theory about his propositions, and then he realizes that on his own terms, he's not entitled to even state these propositions that he wanted to state. And so he says his propositions are like a ladder that he climbs and then throws away or kicks away. And that's what I'm doing here. All these earlier arguments that I made in making my Parmenidean Ascent, I then, my arguments apply to the ladder itself, and I kick away or throw away that ladder itself. But all of these steps are driven by the PSR. So the PSR takes us, if taken seriously, as I think it should be, it takes us all the way in the direction of this extreme monism without distinctions. Even the notion of metaphysical explanation itself has to be given up as long as it's seen as a relational notion. That's the kind of extreme view that I head towards. I think in my interpretation of Parmenides, and André will talk more about this, I know, in my interpretation of Parmenides, I see Parmenides as taking this route too. That's why I call it the Parmenidean Ascent. I think Parmenides rejects distinctions in general. We can't think about non-being. We can't conceive non-being. And I think that Parmenides is driven by the PSR. There are various points, which I outline in the book, where Parmenides' poem moves via an invocation of something like the PSR at several points. So I think Parmenides, I view him in the spirit of the way that I'm arguing. I'm applying it to contemporary and historical philosophy in general to make, I think, what I think is a similar Parmenidean point, or at least on one interpretation of Parmenides. There are a couple of other points that I just want to make really quickly before ending this summary. One is that people might say, hey, well, we like the PSR a little bit, but not that much. Can we limit the PSR in order to avoid this? This is what Kant would do. Kant sees this, that the PSR taken all the way leads to these extreme conclusions. I'm embracing them. Kant wants to avoid them, but I think Kant's strategy for limiting the PSR is incoherent, and I have an argument about that. I think Dasgupta's strategy in contemporary metaphysics for limiting the PSR is similarly incoherent, and I have an argument about that. Another way in which you might think you can avoid my crazy conclusions is by appealing to the method of intuition or reliance on common sense in philosophy, especially in contemporary analytical philosophy. And I challenge the method of reliance on intuitions or common sense. I think it's an inherently conservative methodology. And among other reasons, I would reject that methodology as well. And so then what's left, I think, once we give up relations, we have to give up realism too. The method of intuition is a realist method because it says that our intuitions get us in touch with reality that's out there. We can no longer invest our words and our actions with realist metaphysical significance. So on the one hand, we have an ontology, if we have an ontology at all, with no distinction, just being itself, just action itself, just knowledge itself. So that's our ontology if we had to have any ontology at all. That's why the book has a blank first page as the cover. That's, so if we have an ontology at all, it must be a blank space. It's not as if there's nothing there. It's actually a purely positive affirmation of being itself. That's one way to look at where I wind up. But another way to look at it is that we give up metaphysical realism, any kind of realist investments. And once we do so, once we kick away the ladder, as it were, then we are free to return to all that we did and said previously. So everything in a way looks the same, but it's different. And everything is radically different because everything may look the same, but it's no longer invested with metaphysical significance. So everything has changed as well as everything has stayed the same. So what we give up is a way of giving up metaphysics here that the Parmenidean Ascent involves. And well, that's a lot that I cover there. I'll leave it at that. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Michael. Well, let me hand it over to André Laux. André, after holding various professorships in France and the US, André Laux retired in 2011, but now teaches at the Universidad Panamericana in Mexico City. He's widely written on ancient Greek philosophy, but he's also a preeminent philologist who's partaken in some of the most exciting and important editorial projects in recent decades. I think he's also the most consistent attendee of the Critical Antiquities Workshop, so thanks for that. And we're delighted to host him here more formally to hear what promised to be very interesting comments. Thanks, André.
Well, thank you very much, Tristan. Well, just a word about what you said. I am an attendee. I'm because I think the project is very interesting for reasons that I don't have time to develop, obviously, but I would like to sometime. I think the relationship between what we are doing as ancient philosophers and I feel as philologists on the one hand, as philosophers on the other hand, is in a very difficult and critical situation, and it's high time to reflect about it and to see how to make progress there. Okay, so I was absolutely delighted precisely for this reason that the book of Michael came in my hand. Thank you very much for this. I didn't read it through because I had also other things to do, and but I got a sense of what he is doing. And obviously, since I knew that I would have only 10 minutes or 15 minutes to talk, and I ask you when 12 minutes are over, tell me so that I can wrap up and so on. I don't know exactly how I will do that. Obviously there are many themes that he has broached, and so I concentrate on only one thing, which is monism, and within monism on only one thing, which is Parmenides. And really what I was struck by the first sentence of the book in a chapter which is called Proem, which is an imitation of Parmenides. And I read this sentence. So Michael writes, I have often thought it ironic that the writings of Parmenides, one of the most famous monists in the history of philosophy, are available to us only in the form of fragments. Would that Parmenidean monism had come down to us in the integral form it presumably originally had, a form that would come closer than fragments do to reflecting the monistic world of which he seems to speak. This is an interesting sentence because it's true that we have only fragments of Parmenides, but Parmenides is also the only pre-Socratic philosopher about whom we can have a hunch, more than a hunch actually, of how his whole poem is structured. We know for sure what the organization of the whole was, which changes in some sense the meaning of fragments, because it's fragmentary, not in the sense which is true for other pre-Socratic philosophers. And for those who are not familiar with Parmenides, the structure of the poem is very clear. We have a proem, an introduction, describing the encounter of Parmenides with a goddess that reveals him two things, the truth and something else which is not the truth. And so what I was struck by was by the fact that the whole of Parmenides' poem has the structure of Michael's book as he summarized it just now, namely that there is an ascent, and an ascent in a very geographical or topological sense, because Parmenides is ascending to the goddess, and of course the content of the revelation of the goddess is a sort of of assent too, and the assent has something to do with the principle of sufficient. Sorry, you hear me?
You're fine. Keep going, André.
Okay. So it has something to do with the principle of sufficient reason. I can't dwell on that here. So we have the truth on the one hand, and then we have the second part of the poem, which is, so to speak, a return to the world. And this return to the world looks very much like Michael's return to the world, as he says it, to have an upright view of what is going on in the world. And so I was struck by the common structure of the thought, assent, and there is a ladder, if you want, in Wittgensteinian terms, and then in some way, which is obviously not the same way, but there is a kicking of the ladder, the giving up of the ascent, and then some kind of justification of the world. And so Michael ends up with a skepticism, and Parmenides ends up with something which I won't dwell on either, because it would be, you know, a matter of interpretation. But let's say very briefly that contrary to a very common tradition in Parmenidean studies, which has been taken up kind of blindly by philosophers. And this is a very interesting story, how philosophers can build interesting stories from a conceptual point of view on the basis of a completely naive interpretation of what is going on in a definite author. So I could spend a lot of time, you know, explaining what the relationship is. And actually, I think that's one of the main problems of the relationship between, let's say, specialists in ancient philosophy on the one hand and philosophers, if there is a sense of, to make this distinction here. So anyway, normally, or for a very long time, the second part of Parmenides' poem was thought to be not Parmenidean, to be a sort of, you know, renunciation of not being part of the conceptual discourse, so to speak. And so people think that the world is an error, and for Parmenides, and break their heads asking themselves why on earth Parmenides is going on to describe the world as it might be, or as it is, or as it erroneously is, given that there is only one truth, which is contained in the first part of the problem. Or a more refined version of this, it's not erroneous, but it's just a dialectical exercise in order to convince people that they must return to the first part and let drop the second part. The second part, which is, it must be said, an explanation of the whole world, how the world functions, whereas the first part is an analysis of what it means to be, okay? So my distinction, the distinction that I would like to propose here to Michael is a distinction. I don't know if he can do something without it, or if he wants to do something without it, between what I call Parmenidoid and Parmenidean. And Parmenidean would be, you know, the true Parmenides with its two parts, with fragments, but has a whole. And Parmenidoid is actually a tradition of reading Parmenides, which begins with the very first interpretation of Parmenides, which is that of his disciple Melissus, much less reputed philosopher that Aristotle in particular doesn't like very much, and treats him as if he was you know, secondary rate. But Melissus, I think, is very interesting because he understands very well what is going on in Parmenides. And if you want to be absolutely strict with the principle of sufficient explanation, or the PSR, the PSR, is it? You must give up the world absolutely. So there is no second part of the argument in favor of being in Melissus. You have only an argumentation denouncing the falsity of the world and closing itself to anything which is not, the characteristics of being. So, in fact, my proposal is a generous proposal to Michael to, in the second edition of his book, to rewrite part of what he's saying about Parmenides in order to make him even more Michael-like than Michael himself present him. Okay, so that was basically the first thought. There are two further thoughts. So let me add something, is that what I've been saying is part of the problem that Michael also raises, and which interests me very much. He didn't talk about it in his presentation, but among the distinctions that he rejects is the distinction between philosophy and history of philosophy. If we have time, I would love to have more about this but perhaps it's something that we can discuss at some other time. I mean, I think that there is a distinction, as I think that there are many distinctions. I think that Michael actually thinks also that there are distinctions. I may expand perhaps on this during the discussion. But anyway, the difference between Parmenidoid and Parmenidean would be a matter of making the history of philosophy upright, so to speak. And so it's not negating that philosophy and history of philosophy are tied in a sense that is denied by the classical analytical tradition, but it is more dialectical or more complex perhaps than the simple negation that there is, that basically philosophy and history of philosophy are the same things. Okay, so let me add just two points which I think are important. First, or problematic, at least for me. Michael doesn't talk a lot about monism and monism of being, but he doesn't talk at all, I think, about the problem of the multiple meanings of being, which is actually a great topic of discussion between specialists of Parmenides, and the question is, what is the sense in which Parmenides takes being? And so to make a very long story very short, the basic distinction is between something on the side of existential or substantial, if you want, or essential, and something on the side of predicative. So you have absolute being and predicative being. And I think that you can't really use Parmenides well if you don't decide with good arguments in favor or of one or the other. The majority tradition is the analytical tradition. It derives from the distinction between predicative and existential, and it's on the side of the predicative sense. I am not of this religion. I think that if a sense must be chosen, it is the existential side. The existential is not a good term, but it's on the side of the existential. I think that Michael would be also on this side. The reference to Thomas d'Aquin, to Thomas of Aquinas is very interesting and revealing. But I think that's something that should be really discussed. Because also it has something to do, thank you. So I will be short. It has something also to do with Plato's critique of Parmenides and his distinction, which is explicit, I think, between absolute being and relative being. So that Plato is the one who, in the Sophist, reintroduces the other, that is difference, in a monism, without sacrificing the monism of Parmenides and the negation of absolute being. Plato doesn't negate absolute being, he just introduces a sense of non-being which is compatible with the negation of absolute being, and that's otherness. And this otherness is obviously what Michael is going to try to drive out the history of philosophy, because he wants absolute monism. So I think that this distinction, this Platonic distinction, and all the consequences that drives with him are very important. And the last point and related point, and it's actually the same point, is and that's a question really to Michael, would he accept to make a distinction between non-being and negation on the basis that non-being is something that doesn't exist or is not, whereas negation is a proposition that negates something, and as negating something is not reducible to absolute negation. And if the distinction is valid, what consequences would it have on the whole construct that he has? Interpretation of the Parmenides on the one hand, but also all he says afterwards, and he has summarized in such a marvelous way in his presentation a few minutes ago.
Thanks, André. For the sake of moving on, we'll go to Dimitri now, and we'll give Michael a chance to respond briefly to both André and Dimitri after Dimitri's comments. Let me quickly introduce Dimitry Vardalakis. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Western Sydney University. His wide-ranging philosophical interests, as reflected in his extensive publication record, but he stands out, in my mind at least, through his work on Spinoza, as well as his various contributions to the theorization of agonistic democracy. Two elements or two aspects of his research which are central to the book that will be discussed later today, and we're really pleased that he's able to bring all of these intersecting interests to bear on Michael's book. So take it away, Dimitri.
Yeah, I'll try to be as quick as possible. The sort of response to Michael's book starts with an epigram, which is from Nicomachean Ethics 1139a, and the epigram says, "Thought by itself moves nothing." And I would like to start with an anecdote. So when Tristan and Ben, and thank you so much for organize this workshop, Michael sent me the final proofs of his book for me to be able to read before getting the proper copy. And I responded back and said, "Oh my God, like there is a problem with the PDF. The last chapter is cut off. And in fact, the last chapter just repeats the first sentence, the one that André was talking about. It repeats the first sentence, and that's all there is. There must be a problem with the PDF." And Michael very, very politely, a couple of days later, goes, "Oh, look, in fact, that's not a mistake. That's the way it's meant to be, The sort of argument about non-differentiation, non-relation is kind of represented in the last chapter. And at that moment, I kind of realized two things, okay? On the one hand, and I should have known that already, having read Michael's book on Spinoza and his kind of version of monism. On the one hand, it is really impossible to reconcile Michael with that sort of area, and I don't like this term, called analytic philosophy, because analytic philosophy presupposes that we can separate form from content. Okay, and Michael's book clearly tries to overcome that distinction. On the other hand, I also realized that, and I'm going to use yet another term that I do not like, that Michael cannot be reconciled with what is called continental philosophy. Because continental philosophy presupposes that repetition is difference. And Michael wants to do away with all difference. And, you know, if there is a third realization there, is about the uniqueness of Michael's position in this book. This is a book that is one of a kind, an incredibly ambitious and daring book that tries nothing less than repositioning the way that we do philosophy. This is like one of the most ambitious books I've read for a number of years. Okay, and you know, I'll raise a couple of difficulties that I have with the argument, but this is not to take away from my absolute admiration for what is going on in the Parmenidean Ascent for the reasons that I just described. So at this point, I had a kind of whole kind of summary of Michael's argument, but it's already been done, so I'll just skip it. I had a little joke, maybe I can mention the joke, you know, the Parmenidean Ascent is the overcoming of all relations, understanding being, meaning, action, substance, and so on and so forth as undifferentiated, and Michael calls that the Parmenidean Ascent. I was also calling it the Malevich moment, you know, the pure black or the pure white, you know. So that was the sort of joke in the summary I had prepared, which I will, I'll skip now. And I have two kind of areas where I want to raise some issues, okay? The first pertains to action, and the second pertains to the history of philosophy. The nature of my comments are, like the structure of my comments is the following. I will grant Michael everything, and then I will say, even if I grant you everything, I think what you say is not enough. Okay, so that's the structure. Okay, so one of the chapters, I mean, Michael was describing it very clearly, how he goes through a series of concepts, substance being meaning, explanation, so on and so forth. One of the chapters concerns this radical monist reading of a theory of action. Okay? And what I want to say is that, so the end point of his argument is going to be that, you know, there is nothing but action, in the sense that in order to understand action, we need to do away with all relations and not all differentiations about action. I was going to read a big passage from pages 109 and 110. Maybe I can summarize the first part. He kind of indicates how he wants to overcome a number of theories of actions from Davidson, Anscombe, Frankfurt, and so on. Grounds that I'm reading, we cannot intelligibly place action or actions within reality in a place differentiated from other places. We cannot intelligibly again, you know, relate an action to anything. Okay, and that word intelligibly indicates the sort of key idea that structures Michael's book, which is an idea that we find also in his Spinoza book, namely that monism and the principle of sufficient reason, the demand for intelligibility, are connected. Now, this move to understand action in terms of intelligibility, or like therefore, is really important because it bypasses basically just about every major debate in the theory of action philosophy. It bypasses the ontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics, as well as all theories of the free will. So I indicate that to indicate the radicality of what is going on here. And then the second part, let me keep on reading. Thus, if there is to be action at all, then all is action. This will be a Parmenidean ascent with regard to action, a rejection of certain kinds of relation involving action, and by transcending these relations, an attempt to capture the reality that was only imperfectly expressed by appealing to such relations. That's the typical move of rejecting relations. I'll skip a bit. There is just action, and as before, with the term being and with the same reservations, the term action can be seen as something like a mass noun, not a Kant noun. Then I skip a bit again. The world itself is pure act. There is nothing but action, and all is action. And I was going to indicate here a point also that Michael indicated. If we agree with this view, this leads to a radical skepticism. The Parmenidean Ascent, that's page 111, with regard to action, is vastly skeptical in the sense that it denies that we can coherently conceive of the differentiated actions and agents that we hold dear. Okay. So I think that presents, the conjunction of monism and the principles of sufficient reason, the demand for intelligibility, and the skeptical kind of outcome, all is action, presents sufficiently, I think, the sort of key frame, the framework of Michael's position. Now, I have 3 comments on that. First, even if we grant this, everything that I just described, if we grant it, it seems to me that is raising a trivial point, because we don't really learn anything about action then. How can we even recognize action? What is the sort of point or impetus of describing action as all is action? The point of action is that we can act differently. There is different ways of conceiving action. It's not to go back to the ontological or free will kind of accounts of action. What would it be like to remain a monist and also say there are different accounts of action? And I'm saying that, and that's the second point, because there's a whole history that reads monism in the sense of this undifferentiated being as inherently apolitical. Okay, and that in fact is the most prominent kind of response to Spinoza or Spinozism in the immediate aftermath of the publication of his work. And I'm thinking here especially of Bayle's dictionary and the entry on Spinozism. One of his most famous examples from that entry is, he says, well, according to Spinozism, understood as pure undifferentiated being, is that we're incorrect if we say that, the Turks killed the Germans killed 10,000 Turks. We should be saying that God, instantiated as Turks, killed himself, instantiated as 10,000 Turks. Okay. So, and this is meant to show that there is no monist politics. And in a sense, the third point I want to raise from that is, I just cannot see how it's possible to have a practical philosophy if we stay simply within this radical monism that Michael describes. And that, in a sense, that's very similar to the point that André was making as well. We need to go to the second part as well of Parmenides' poem. Let me go to the second point. I was going to offer a kind of solution to this conundrum, but maybe I can talk about it when we talk about my book. So Michael turns to the history of philosophy, and he makes a critique of a number of ways that philosophy is conceived in the analytic tradition. In particular, he identifies 3 methodologies, if you want, whereby analytic philosophy proceeds: the appeal to intuition, or he refers to it as MI at certain points, the methodology of intuition, or common sense, even though the two are not exactly the same. So, an analytic philosopher will say, well, I intuit that something is wrong, or usually something is completely bonkers, so I'll just reject it, So the fact that radical monism is counterintuitive should count as enough for its rejection. The idea of realism, that there's an objective reality independent of thought, and the idea of discreteness. There are beings that are separated and therefore related. Okay, so Michael says that these are the three, in a sense, cardinal sins of analytic philosophy, and his kind of move beyond analytic philosophy is by criticizing these 3 points: intuition, realism, and discreteness, and through his own notion of monism, he goes on to advocate for the importance of the history of philosophy as a result of the critique of these points. Okay. This holism, I'm reading from page 194-95, and he was just referring before to Quine's holism, okay, from the 2 dogmas of empiricism. This holism, run amok, has momentous implications in 2 different directions of the study of the history of philosophy and of philosophy itself. First, given the Parmenidean Ascent with regard to meaning, lesion of relation, differentiation, and so on and so forth, the meaning of contemporary text and position is fixed by, inter alia, the meaning of older texts and positions in philosophy. Thus, in light of this Parmenidean Ascent, it is of course the case the history of philosophy is relevant to contemporary philosophy and to the meaning of contemporary texts. And in the other direction, perhaps more surprisingly, the meaning of older historical propositions to text is fixed by, inter alia, the meaning of later texts and propositions in philosophy, for instance, by the text and propositions in contemporary philosophy. Since all is relevant to the meaning of all, this notion of holism, there is no principled way to distinguish between philosophy and the study of its history. Right? I could not agree more. Right? I could not agree more. But, and that's the sort of, that's not enough kind of moment, but isn't that what continental philosophy also does? And in particular, one of the sort of key cardinal figures of continental philosophy, Martin Heidegger, who precisely turns to Parmenides and other figures, but Parmenides is a key reference for Heidegger, to make precisely this point. There is a holism of meaning, what Bin and Time he calls the world. We cannot have discrete kind of nuggets of meaning that we're talking about. There is one being, even though it can be expressed in different ways, according to Heidegger. And this demands this kind of 2-way give and take of philosophy. Now, I don't want to defend Heidegger. Far from that, I'm very critical of Heidegger's project in many ways. But it seems to me that if Michael is to take seriously the proposition that he's making, he needs to sort of include a proper name like Heidegger in a book that bears the title Parmenides. That's the sort of proposition that I want to put forward. And that returns me to the point that I started with, and that'll be my conclusion. But in a sense, Michael cannot turn to Heidegger because, okay, sure, he's rejected analytic philosophy, but he also rejects continental philosophy in a sense, because continental philosophy is premised on the idea that repetition is difference. Right? So for Heidegger, there is being, and there is beings that repeat being, but in a different way. We'll find the same point in Derrida, Deleuze, and so on and so forth. Okay? Whereas Michael, in his very strict monism, cannot say that. So Michael finds himself, in a sense, caught between analytic and continental philosophy in a very interesting way that challenges both. But it seems to me that he needs to sort of, in order to make this statement about the history of philosophy, he needs to at least gesture and make the sort of same critique of continental philosophy that he makes of analytic philosophy. Okay, these are all the comments that I want to make. And as I said, these are not to diminish my absolute admiration of the book.
Thanks, Dimitri. So at the risk of blowing out time completely, we wanted to give Michael a little chance to respond to André and Dimitri initially. So Michael, can you make maybe 2 points, one to André, one to Dimitri, in quick response?
Why don't I make a point to the 2 of them at the same time then? So I do want to move things along, but I really appreciate and welcome these generous comments from both of you. The point in which I think Dimitri pointed out, there's a connection between the two comments, is André was mentioning that, what do I say about the second half of Parmenides' poem where he gives his kind of cosmology, and it seems to involve distinctions. Dimitri was saying that there's no room for political philosophy or the practical philosophy, on my view. If all is action, there's no differentiation. You quoted Aristotle, thought by itself moves nothing, and that's a danger. Let me try to address both of those points very briefly. I think that there's a reason why, I didn't look at Melissus for a model, as André was perhaps suggesting generously, that maybe Melissus is more Michael-like than Parmenides. And that's partly because I think that the second half of Parmenides' poem is really interesting. And from my interpretation, I didn't talk about this in the book this way, but your comments have led me to think in this direction. I think the second half of Parmenides' poem can be seen as what happens once you kick away the ladder. You go back to doing what you were normally doing, giving your best theory of the world, but devoid of metaphysical significance. There's no such second half in Melissus' poem, and that, I think, makes him a less appropriate representative of the Parmenidean view, because there has to be this moment, what happens after you throw away the ladder. And that's what I want to say in response to Dimitri too, is that, yes, I think I worry about the political ramifications with the possibility of the entailment that it's apolitical, the Parmenidean Ascent. And I don't want it to be that way. And I've been thinking about what happens when the ladder is kicked away, because I view that as an opening for productive political engagement. I want it to be that. And so I think that your comments too really helped me to see that I do need to engage more with perhaps the continental tradition. I didn't criticize the continental tradition because I thought I was doing enough in criticizing the analytical tradition, and I don't know the continental tradition as well as I want to. But that's actually a direction really now for me to think about much more carefully, perhaps to locate the kind of political action that would be relevant as in what happens once we kick away the ladder. Because I think there's room for that, because as I said, everything has changed and nothing has changed once we kick away the ladder. And that's a window for this kind of engagement. There's lots of other things in both of your comments that I don't have time to respond to now, but maybe they'll come back again in the further questions.
Thanks, Michael. So we're going to take questions from the rest of our participants after we've had a look at Dimitri's book. So could you hold them for now? And once we've finished with Dimitri's book, we'll have people write their questions in the chat function. For now, let's turn to Dimitri and his book. I've already introduced him. So Dimitri, I would love to hear you give a bit of a summary introduction to the book before we turn to Russ and Michael again.
First, I'd like to thank Tristan and Ben for the workshop and the rest of the participants. But also I would like to thank a number of friends who've heard parts of the workshop and are present here. In particular, two of my old students from other parts of the world, including from Pennsylvania, which made us kind of happy, and who contributed to the writing of the book through various ideas. So thanks to Michael and Taha. I'm not going to do a summary of the whole book. I'll just sort of do three kind of vignettes. The first one is give a little bit of background about how I got to Spinoza and I got to write this book. The second is something about the sort of idea of interpretation and Epicureanism and so on and so forth. And the third is a little bit about the contemporary relevance of what I was trying to do in the book. So
That's bad news.
Yeah.
That Jacobi.
Can you hear us? You just froze. Could you just rewind about 20 seconds? Just to say,
okay. All right. The idea of the book came from, well, my turn to Spinoza comes from my PhD, because for my PhD I worked on the doppelganger, And the term doppelganger is born in various ways that I describe in my book, out of the second debate that Jacobi has with Fichte, which is one of the major motivating factors that reintroduces Spinoza in philosophy, around the time of German idealism. And then after my PhD, I turned to Spinoza and started working on Spinoza. Now, there were various books that were really important for me at that time. So we're talking about 2007, thereabouts, in my kind of, I had never studied Spinoza at the university. So, I had to sort of educate myself. And a book that was very important for me was Moira Gatton's and Genevieve Lloyd's book on collective imaginings. Another one was Antonio Negri's book, The Savage Anomaly. And the third one was actually, it came right at that time, Michael's book on Spinoza. They were all three important for different ways, but in a sense, these three books led me to this idea that I developed in the book, namely that what I call Epicureanism has three themes, so to speak. The first one is a critique of authority. The second is a notion of sort of practical judgment that concerns itself with calculations of means and ends. And the third is the idea of monism. I mean, clearly the idea of monism comes from Michael's book. So that's in terms of the sort of background of how I got to the book. And then just a little bit about the book and interpretation and so on and so forth. I should say that the book, it has a very traditional, quaint even, but that's quaint structure, but that's a kind of intentional, it's a kind of playful kind of way of using that structure, which consists basically in reading the theological political treatise from the very beginning to the very end. Okay? And when I say from the very beginning, I mean from the very beginning, from the title itself, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Okay? So I was stuck on the title for a very long time. What does Theologico-Politicus mean? It's not very obvious. And if you look at the secondary literature, there's been no particularly illuminating kind of explanation of what Theologico-Politicus means. And for a number of reasons, I came to realize that actually the meaning is very obvious, so long as we realize that there is a concept that is very clear. The clarity of that concept in the 17th century is very different from what we understand by this concept today, and that is the concept of authority. Authority from the Roman Republic all the way to around the time of the French Revolution has a very clear meaning. Someone has authority insofar as they cannot be argued with. That meaning changes with Weber and others later on to mix up authority and sovereignty, but that meaning is very clear back then. And authority has two sources. One is theological. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, that means revelation. In the Roman tradition means, the members of the Senate as the sort of descendants of the founders of Rome, and so on and so forth. So the one meaning is theological, one source of that authority is theological, and the other is political, the law. Okay? So, suddenly I came to realize, well, that's the meaning of the title. Okay, so we can go to the rest of the text now. And then I came to realize that the sort of, from the various schools of thought, from antiquity to early modernity, the one that most clearly offers a critique of authority is Epicureanism. Characteristic of this critique of authority is the opening of Lucretius' De Rerum Natura, which starts with a hymn to Aphrodite, and then he goes on to a critique of religio, sometimes translated as religion. But the example that he gives, the sacrifice of Viginia, I think could suggest that it's actually a critique of authority. Because the way Lucretius presents the sacrifice of Viginia is like, we have here, in order for this a young girl to be sacrificed, we have a collusion, we have a secret kind of collaboration between the political authority of Agamemnon and the theological authority of the priests that sell us this kind of gobbledygook that, you know, the gods stop the wind from blowing and, you know, the army is stuck in a bliss. And we need to sacrifice the girl in order for the wind to blow again and the army to be able to sail to Troy. So it is this critique of the double source of authority, political and theological, that is the sort of opening move of the only whole Epicurean book that has survived. So that sort of got me down the path of Epicureanism. And the second kind of big realization when I got into Epicureanism was that the critical authority was not enough. There was a second strong political element. And that was a very bizarre and unexpected way in which phronesis of practical judgment that relies on the calculation of means and ends, is presented within the Epicurean tradition. To cut a long story very, very short, Epicurus says very clearly, the source of every kind of knowledge is phronesis, and he describes phronesis in terms of the calculation of means and ends. So we have then two elements in Epicureanism. On the one hand, authority, on the other hand, the calculation of utility. And the whole book is about what is the relation between these two elements, the critique of authority and the calculation of utility. On the face of it, it appears as if they contradict each other. If we are to calculate our utility, then we have to be free from the authority that constrains our capacity to do so. On the other hand, and that's the paradox, on the other hand, it can also be advisable on certain occasions to give up our judgment and adhere to a certain authority that knows better than us. A typical example of that would be how to deal with a medical emergency, be that a pandemic or whatever. You need to let the experts decide, and that is to your utility. Okay? So there is this sort of strange tension then between authority and utility that sort of structured the whole reading, the whole interpretation of the theological political treatise. And it was very interesting because, in fact, Spinoza uses terms like auctoritas and terms like utilitas very consistently. But if you actually read the translations in English and in other languages too, none of these terms is translated consistently. So it's actually very interesting going to the text and finding the consistent way in which these two terms are translated in terms of establishing the sort of tension between authority and utility. Now, and that's very quickly, the third and final point was the importance of that sort of reading of Spinoza, contemporary importance. Okay? So one effect of the fact that there's sort of paradoxical relation between authority and the calculation of utility is that there is a tension there. There is a kind of impossibility to completely reconcile authority and the calculation of utility. Neither a politics of authority nor a politics of a pure calculation of utility is possible according to Spinoza. And this means that there's always a tension between them. And this seems to me to suggest a kind of politics that kind of outflanks or bypasses, if you want, a whole discourse in political theory and political philosophy about things like consensus, things like concord or monia, as Aristotle puts it, or things about how we can understand politics by reducing it to the operation of political institutions. So it seems to me that this kind of Epicurean dialectic can lead to a notion of tension or agonism, that's my preferred word, that kind of outflanks a number of debates that have led to a kind of understanding of liberalism, political liberalism or liberal democracy and so on and so forth, that has dominated political philosophy and political theory for a good many years now. And outflanking this kind of debates kind of has the capacity to renew these debates in various ways. So that was the sort of more kind of contemporary impetus of doing the sort of analysis that I wanted to do. So there's not exactly a summary of the whole book, but is identifying a number of ideas and kind of desires, fulfilled or unfulfilled, to write this book. Thanks.
Thanks, Dimitri. That's great. Okay, well, let me introduce the final presenter for today. This is Russ Leo. He's Associate Professor in the Department of English at Princeton University. His work engages numerous and intersecting fields in early modern literature, especially poetry, philosophy, and political economy, which is informed by keen interest in theory and criticism, especially as they have been influenced by the work of Spinoza and Spinozism. I'm particularly pleased that Russ could join us because, among other things, he's currently working on a book that explores Spinoza's influence on the origins of political economy. Not only am I eagerly awaiting that book's publication, which he's told me won't be for a little while, much to my sadness, but given Dimitri's views on the compatibility of practical reason in Epicureanism, Spinoza, and contemporary economic subjects, which he takes on in this book, I'm really glad that we're able to get Russ's perspective today. So thanks, Russ.
Let me begin by thanking Tristan and Ben for inviting me to participate in this workshop, and for this opportunity to respond to, Dimitri, can I call you by your first name? I have you by your last name throughout this whole thing, but it seems so formal for me to do that now, I know, but okay, I'll say.
I really don't mind how you call me. You can call me Kate if you want, I don't care.
There we go, yeah. But really to respond to Dimitri's magnificent book, Spinoza the Epicurean. It's a book that I read with great joy and admiration, and which I think sheds new light not only on Spinoza's own philosophy, but, and what I'm going to try to talk about today, also on some of his earliest readers' attempts to reckon with his Epicureanism. Put simply, I hope to suggest today that Dimitri's theses on Spinoza's Epicureanism relate directly to how Jarek Jellis, Lodewijk Meyer, and the members of the artistic collective Nil Volentibus Ardum framed Spinoza's philosophy for 17th century audiences. So Spinoza's interlocutors all seem to confirm and at times affirm his Epicureanism, precisely as Dimitri describes it. And I'll proceed, however tentatively, to recount several of Dimitri's claims about this dialectic of authority and utility, suggesting that he discovers in this book new ways of relating Spinoza's project to the work of his contemporary interlocutors. So first, I'll undermine how his treatments of the power of error relate directly to how Nil Volentibus Ardum approached and revised French neoclassical theories of genre and performance with an eye to utility. And second, I'll try to relate how Dimitri's account of the Golden Rule from Christ's Sermon on the Mount figures prominently in Jellis's own presentation of Spinoza's work, obscuring, just as Dimitri says, and I quote here, the fact that judgment as a calculation of how one's actions lead to communal utility has its source in Epicureanism. Well, before I move to the Holland of the 1660s and 70s, however, I do want to underscore my great esteem for Dimitri's archive and method in this book. In sophisticated and innovative treatments of figures like Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari, Antonio Negri, Etienne Balibar, Frederic Lordon, and Pierre Clastre, among many others, Dimitri makes the current stakes of Spinoza's Epicureanism remarkably clear. As such, it marks a crucial contribution to their intellectual history, training our eye to practical concerns and to exercises of power instead of sovereignty and right, all too familiar and often frustrating horizons for histories of Enlightenment and Dutch republicanism, as well as contemporary politics. And it seems to me that work like this helps us see heretofore neglected continuities between, say, the work of the company state in early modernity and much more recent exercises of power at work in the proliferation of borders, operations of capital, and discourses on security. Dimitri's gestures to neo-Epicureanism and to a politics beyond political theory introduce an Epicurean Spinoza to a host of contemporary theorists, and in many ways marks a break with the Spinozism of the 1960s and 70s. And this is an exciting and urgent direction, one that warrants attention and discussion. And I certainly don't want what I present today to undermine that history. But with that said, let me turn to nil volentibus arduum. Hereafter, I'll just call him nil. That is to the artistic society or Kunstgenootschap that began meeting in 1669 in order to reform poetry and language in the Dutch Republic. The members of nil, which included Spinoza's close friends Lodewijk Meyer and Johannes Bouwmeester, promoted an intellectual theater that might shape and serve a more rational citizenry. Tellingly, their philosophical poetics, which is the nauwkeurig onderwijs in de toneelpoëzie, or precise instruction in dramatic poetry, reflects a keen familiarity with Spinoza's own theses on the affects and the imagination. The reformation of theater, they assert, requires a rational account of nature, particularly the nature of the affects. And careful readings of their dispatches reveal that theirs is, in many instances, a decidedly monist approach. In turn, the members offer a detailed and expansive theory of the hartstochten, that is, affects or passions, which grounds their accounts of art and its effects. And they are adamantly and repeatedly invested in a tension between pleasure and understanding. Now, it's all too common to see this tension mischaracterized as, say, an antagonism between the cheap, easy pleasure that theater affords, which many see as an erroneous pleasure that most arts facilitate, and one which stands opposed to a clear and distinct theoretical understanding of nature, an understanding that effectively precludes any use for error or fiction. As if theater, whether it relies on spectacle and histrionic acting like English drama, or whether it carries with it an oppressive French royalism, as in the neoclassical drama after Corneille and Racine, it's as if theater presents a fundamentally irrational challenge to adequate understanding. And so it would seem, for nil to affirm the powers of the false, they must break fundamentally with an uncompromisingly rational Spinozism, as if art is an imaginative enterprise that always stands opposed to exercises of knowledge of the second kind, an opposition that precludes hermeneutics that point to the use of instrumental rationality. Assumptions like this, it should be said, have made it historically difficult to connect Spinoza with various artistic movements, despite his proximity to many of the most influential aesthetes and leafhebbers of his day. Dimitri offers us a way out of this bind in the book. So let me recount here his signal intervention early in Spinoza the Epicurean, as he underscores the importance of practical knowledge, phronesis, a, quoting here, judgment that is understood in instrumental terms, or as the calculation of one's utility, a judgment that arises by assessing or calculating one's given circumstances, a judgment that, in the TTP, Spinoza discovers in an ongoing dialectical relationship with authority, and thus a judgment that is in an ongoing dialectical relationship with pleasure, insofar as it is most pleasurable to maximize one's powers of activity against authority as such. In this sense, Dimitri claims, Spinoza readily recognizes the power, even the utility of error. The dialectic of authority and utility, and I quote again, is not concerned with the truth or falsity of judgments that pertain to action. And such effects are registered when mistakes are made just as much, if not more, than when the correct decisions are taken. Errors are productive, even productive of authority, and this authority is renewed or renegotiated in its continuous tension with a pleasure utility. Here, in the dialectic of authority and utility, we'd catch a glimpse of Nil's theory of theater, at least at their most Spinozistic moments. And I should say here that one of the most frustrating things, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to read the Onderwijs, which is Nil's statement. It wasn't published until the 18th century. But what often happens, because it's a collective document, is the various contributors will contradict themselves. So I'm here referring to the most Spinozistic moments of that text, which perhaps unsurprisingly are those that are written by Baumeister and Meyer. So if heretofore Nil seemed opposed to a Spinoza who was preoccupied with an understanding approaching Aristotelian episteme, Dimitri directs us to revisit these materials with new eyes. Our Dutch writers, Spinoza's friends and interlocutors, are strategically revising French neoclassical texts, which, it must be said, are overwhelmingly Aristotelian, written not just under the influence of the Poetics, but really of a Poetics that is read more often than not directly in relation to the Organon. So here, the Spinoza's friends and interlocutors are upsetting the hierarchical relation between pleasure and theoretical understanding, so familiar to, say, readers of Horace. And they place these terms in tension, unmistakably foregrounding the practical, use or utility. This is Dimitri's Epicurean phronesis. Across their philosophical poetics, the members of Nil are preoccupied with utility as a key term, the utility of spectacle, the utility of affects, even like wonder, which are otherwise impediments to theoretical understanding. And Dimitri makes the very terms of such poetics take on new meaning. Consider, for instance, the title of Andreas Pell's 1681 Ars Poetica, the Gebruik en Misbruik des Toneels, or the use and abuse of the theater. Or consider even how Jarig Jellis, to whom I'll turn in a moment, deliberately contrasts things useful to understanding with things evil, insofar as they prevent us from understanding, foregrounding this distinction between utility and evil, not good and evil, in his Dutch preface to the Opera Postuma. These early modern figures testify, however proleptically, to Dimitri's account in Spinoza the Epicurean, and even widen the scope of the book to include species of error beyond scriptural interpretation, namely mimetic experiments in tragedy and comedy, to say nothing of the Spanish Golden Age lyrics and picaresque novels to which Spinoza was evidently devoted. The same might be said of Dimitri's comments on the Golden Rule, an expression of the calculation of utility, of phronesis, that was palatable to readers for whom Epicureanism was otherwise loathsome and dangerous. It's not just Spinoza who collated Christ's Sermon on the Mount with instrumental rationality. So too did Jellis in the preface to the Dutch Opera Postuma, the Nachgelaten Schriften, in an attempt to render Spinoza's thought palatable to collegiate audiences. So if Dimitri exposes with remarkable clarity Spinoza's hermeneutical theory, particularly in his chapter 5, Jellis adheres to this theory when he summarizes Spinoza's own corpus. So let me back up a bit here and draw Jellis and Dimitri together in their meditations on the Golden Rule. So Spinoza's friend Jellis delivers an original and comprehensive account of the philosopher's thought in the preface to the Nachgelaten Schriften, an introductory essay that he composed in Dutch before it was rendered into Latin by, again, Lodewijk Meyer. Despite its historical importance, however, the preface is rarely reprinted and often neglected by scholars. Jellis identifies the author of the posthumous collection as BDS and attributes to him the anonymous TTP, a work in which, and I quote here, many profound and considerable things concerning theology and Holy Scripture, as well as the true foundations of a republic, are treated. I learned a lot even reading the book how now the shorthand could be Spinoza deals with authority. And I feel like this is a case where that's tied directly to a notion of authority that would have been very familiar to 17th and early 18th century philologists, a notion of literary authority as well. And so maybe there's a philological archive that could be useful to deepening the point that Dimitri makes. So while Yellis is not the first to identify Spinoza as the author of the anonymous work, he is perhaps the first to articulate, at least in print, how the philosopher's TTP relates to his ethics. Spinoza's philosophy, he argues, neither contradicts nor challenges the basic principles of Christianity. On the contrary, careful readers will recognize a rational religion in the ethics that also subtends what might otherwise appear as a critique of religion in the TTP. For the sake of time, I'll skip. I have a thing here, but I'll say, in other words, Christ, Spinoza, and the apostles all teach precisely what, and I quote Yellis again, reason or the understanding prescribes. They share an ethics that Jesus summarized when he asserted that, in order to acquire salvation, all we must do is love God above all and our neighbors as ourselves. God boven alles en ons naaste als onszelven moet liefhebben. Here, in other words, Yellis makes precisely the gesture that Dimitri identifies. Yellis derives these principles solely from the ethics and affirms at once both monism and the irreducible importance of phronesis. Speaking to those who are, quote, neither satisfied with the appearance or truth, nor moved by authority, that's him, who desire sound reasoning and infallible truths, Yellis turns to scripture only to confirm what this sense of reason makes evident. He thus reframes Spinoza's claim that, quote, although religion, as the apostles preached it, by relating the simple story of Christ, does not fall under reason, nevertheless, by the natural light everyone can easily appreciate its most important themes, which, like the whole of Christ's teaching, consist chiefly of moral lessons. Reading the TTP by way of the ethics, Yellis presents Christianity as a rational religion and marshals passages of the ethics to illustrate the degree to which Spinoza himself acknowledges a rational religion that corresponds to Christianity, albeit a minimal Christianity at odds with virtually all of his contemporary alternatives. It's thus by way of the ethics that Yellis arrives at the conclusion that we must love God above all and our neighbors as ourselves. That is, because we acquire the eternal love of God through intellectual knowledge, and those who have acquired intellectual knowledge of God strive for friendship and love for others. Only then does Yellis invoke Christ and the apostles to underline that their teachings confirm with reason. Indeed, the ethical doctrines of the Christian religion, he says, are completely contained in this short statement about love for God and one's neighbors. It expresses in brief everything that's necessary to know for salvation. And as the ethical doctrines of Christianity are rational, so too does Yellis explicitly identify Christianity as a redelijke godsdienst, a rational religion. To the latter, Yellis makes no effort to demonstrate that any knowledge of Scripture is necessary for salvation. With this in mind, he determines that Christ's teachings, evident as they are in Scripture, are rational insofar as they can be summarized thus. Again, love God above all and our neighbors as ourselves. Yellis was a member of the Mennonite congregation led by Helenius Abrahams, a collegian who, according to Andrew Fix, affirmed that any religious association in the corrupt world of his day could be nothing more than a gathering of like-minded people freely confessing their similar beliefs, who emphatically rejected the idea that his own congregation or any other could rightfully claim to be the one and only true Church of Christ on earth. That is to say, the collegiate project was one of constant tension with authority. And like many 17th century chrétiens sans église, Helenius and Yellis alike were attracted to collegiate meetings at Amsterdam, where various members across denominations would discuss reason, scripture, and the relationship between philosophy and Christianity. To this audience, Yellis presents Spinoza's work as consonant with scripture, insofar as both Scripture and Spinoza emphasize practical knowledge. And since they both foreground the fact that, and I'm quoting Dimitri here, circumstance is determinative. Especially relevant here is Dimitri's assertion, and let me quote this passage at some length, that friendship in the Epicurean sense shows that phronesis is shareable. And this sharing is not a contingent characteristic, but a predicate of phronesis. It shows that utility is not personal, but rather reciprocal. The exigency to love your friend as yourself is not a law independent of the given circumstances. Rather, it is the indispensable precondition of maximizing our utility in the given circumstances by recognizing that utility is never personal, but only ever reciprocal. This is not only one of the most striking and frankly moving sections in Dimitri's book, this affirmation that the fulfillment of utility is in friendship is also, in so many ways, an apt description of collegiate practices themselves as they emerged and developed across the 17th century. The abiding Dutch Epicureanism of the 17th century, Dimitri obliquely suggests, was practical, evident in the ethics and practices of the colleges themselves as they emerged in response to counter-remonstrant crackdown. And so where I want to end here is to really underline the degree to which this book, I think, charts a new course for how even to read a history of the reception of Epicureanism in the 17th century, not just among the Dutch, but among the English. The book begins by really departing from the notion that Epicureanism is a kind of sensualism, which for so many readers of the 17th century, they get stuck on that point. The Epicureans are the, Rochester, John Wilmot, or, the various libertines. But what this book suggests is a very different history of Epicureanism, and where the collegiate practices with which we know Spinoza is familiar, and to which we know Spinoza's, at least the opera posthuma, is directly pitched by folks like Jellis and Jan Revorts, both of whom are devoted collegians. This really does set a new agenda and urge us to think about not just this Epicurean friendship, but also its political and critical valences in the period, and I think perhaps towards a different reception history of the colleges that you see playing out in collective projects like, among many other, well, I'll stop there actually, rather than vamping on contemporary things. But basically it seems to me that not only is this a book on Spinoza's Epicureanism, but it also trains our attention to new ways of understanding 17th century Epicureanism in practice, and in foregrounding this tension between phronesis and authority. The colleges, among so many other institutions and movements, really do embody and practice these principles. And it's not just a textual history, which has led to so many dead ends for the reception history of Epicureanism. You stop there.
Thanks so much, Russ. That's really engaging. So I'll throw to Michael Della Rocca, who's going to comment on Dimitri's book. And I just wanted to reassure our audience that most of our presenters are able to stay a little beyond the scheduled finish time, so that there will be indeed time for your questions. Perhaps if you message me and tell me whether you have a need to go at the assigned finish time, then I'll know to throw to you quickly once we get into the discussion. So without further ado, Michael.
Great, thank you. I'll shorten my comments too, so as to leave more time for questions at the end. I just want to say that I really admired Dimitri's book, as I'll explain now. One of the things that's really striking about the book is that for Spinoza, as Dimitri sees, there's no bracketing of the practical and the theoretical. The two are intertwined in a way. It's the pervasiveness of the practical in Spinoza that's one of the wonderful themes, I think, in Dimitri's book. For Dimitri Spinoza as this is a quote, every kind of knowledge is inextricable from practical concerns, and indeed knowledge is power, Dimitri says for Spinoza. This interpenetration of the practical and theoretical in Spinoza has been noted many times before, but what's distinctive and especially illuminating about Dimitri's prosecution of this theme is the way in which he ties it distinctively to Epicurean thought. Now, one way in which Dimitri does this is begins with Aristotle. As Dimitri reads Aristotle, although practical wisdom or phronesis and theoretical knowledge or episteme are importantly connected, episteme enjoys primacy over phronesis. The practical can in a way be bracketed when one focuses on the theoretical. Now, I need not, and I'm not really in a position to offer any kind of expert assessment of this reading of Aristotle, because for our purposes here today, this morning, this evening, and for the purposes of Dimitri's book, the key point is that Epicurus reverses this order of priority. For Epicurus, as Dimitri says, phronesis is more significant either than philosophy. This is a quote actually from Diogenes Laertius. Now, and as Dimitri puts it, Epicureanism asserts the primacy of phronesis over episteme. Now, according to Dimitri, Spinoza follows Epicurus in this reversal. For Dimitri Spinoza, thought is through and through practical. This is a kind of monism, I think, within thought, a unity of the practical and the theoretical. And this monism within thought is, for Dimitri, connected in both Epicurus and Spinoza to a more general monism of God and nature and to a rejection of creation ex nihilo. So great is this interpenetration of the practical and the theoretical in Spinoza that not only is it the case that knowledge or a certain kind of rational thought is power for Spinoza, but it's also the case that even less good or more confused thought, that is error, is power, is productive. So for Dimitri Spinoza, error is productive for better or worse. Dimitri illuminatingly traces the way in which the three crucial errors had momentous and in some respects good and necessary effects in the formation, development, and the maintenance of the ancient Hebrew state. Now, chief among those errors was the error on the part of the prophets who failed to understand the nature of God's power. The prophets mistakenly anthropomorphize God and attribute to God artificial power analogous to the kind that a sovereign enjoys. The prophets fail to see that divine power has no such contingent origins and is indeed simply the power or the potentia of nature itself, which operates with necessity. The prophets, in other words, fail to appreciate the truth of monism, understood as the view that God simply is nature itself and acts with the necessity of nature. This error on the part of the prophets is, as Dimitri notes, nonetheless productive, for it helps to give the prophets, with their claimed special relation to an anthropomorphized God, a share of the kind of authority that God is said to have. And in having this authority, this immunity for a time at least to being challenged, the prophets are able to help the state solidify its power in a way that's useful for the state and for its citizens. Now here Dimitri sets up what he calls, as we saw today, he calls the dialectic of utility and authority, a precarious dialectic inevitably laden with a potential for conflict, but also inevitably productive, even and especially when the source of this dialectic lies in Spinoza in the characteristically Epicurean primacy of the practical. Now, so Dimitri locates the source of this dialectic in Spinoza in the primacy of the practical, and this Epicurean window onto Spinoza's political philosophy and his metaphysics more generally is enormously and uniquely valuable. And readers of Dimitri's book will come away from Dimitri's book with a wholly new perspective on Spinoza's thought. Now, in order to engage further with the richness of Dimitri's interpretation, I want to suggest that there may be other errors, or what Spinoza would see as errors, that this interpretation, Dimitri's interpretation, may put us in a position to see. That is, I want to push Dimitri's interpretation in a direction that he himself may not pursue, but that his interpretation may encourage. In particular, I want to suggest that Dimitri's interpretation can provide new encouragement for an even more deeply monistic reading of Spinoza, and for a reading in which the practical occupies an even more important place than it does on Dimitri's interpretation. So I will focus actually just on two. I only have time for two potential errors that Spinoza might recognize as errors, but that Dimitri doesn't identify, I think, as such. First, as I mentioned, Dimitri sees Spinoza as embracing the primacy of the practical over the theoretical. But in according this kind of primacy, such an approach recognizes a distinction between the practical and the theoretical. But I want to take seriously the thought that for Spinoza, he wants to reject any such distinction between the practical and the theoretical, and that for Spinoza, the practical and theoretical, far from standing in one or another relation of primacy, as Dimitri suggests, far from that, the practical and the theoretical are identical for Spinoza. They're one and the same. And Spinoza, in effect, says this in 2p49 corollary in the Ethics, when he says the will and intellect are one and the same. So I think that suggests an even more thoroughgoing identity of the practical and theoretical than the kind of primacy that Dimitri says that the practical enjoys over the theoretical. They're not distinct in any way. They're totally one and the same. There's more to say about that, but I just want to go to the other error for a moment, and this is about teleology. The other error that Spinoza might recognize, not an error in what Dimitri says. So here too, with regard to teleology, there's room for a more radical version of the view that Dimitri presents for us. Dimitri rightly denies that for Spinoza there is any ultimate end of the universe. He denies that there's any teleology, any divine teleology for Spinoza. And this is a characteristically Epicurean aspect of Spinoza's thought, as Dimitri notes. Now, although Spinoza thus rejects what might be called divine teleology, Dimitri is happy to see Spinoza's allowing and indeed insisting that humans act for the sake of an end. So for Dimitri, Spinoza, there's a rejection of teleology that's not total. There is human teleology, at least, even if there is no divine teleology. And here I think we're coming at the points that Dimitri mentioned about my book. Now, but I think there's a strong case can be made for the view that even in the human case, we do not act for the sake of an end. Not only does God not act for the sake of an end, we don't either. I think that's a more thoroughgoing rejection of teleology. And there's a bunch of texts that we could fight about in Spinoza, including the Scholium to Proposition 9 of Part 3, Letter 58, which talks about freedom. But I think those passages point to the view that for Spinoza, even in our case, we're not being pulled along by some kind of end that pulls us on. Rather, we're being pushed by efficient causation alone. So I think there's room for that kind of reading, a more thoroughgoing denial of teleology in Spinoza. And I think what's playing a role here is, for me, it's not surprising that I'm going to say this, is the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. The PSR is, I think, at the basis of Spinoza's thoroughgoing rejection of teleology, not just divine teleology, but even in the human case, just as I think the PSR was behind the identification of the will and the intellect in 2p49 corollary for Spinoza. There's a lot more to say about that, but I just want to close by pointing out something that really, I think, ties Dimitri's book to my own approach to Spinoza and to my own book, The Parmenidean Ascent. Dimitri rightly insists that for Spinoza, certain errors on the part of the prophets and others are productive. And I think that's right. And I think what's really insightful is that Dimitri says that this suggests that Spinoza's work can be seen as belonging to the comic genre, where errors lead to things that are good and productive. It's a kind of like a happy ending for us all, as opposed to tragedies where errors lead to disasters and horrible things, right? So Spinoza's book can be seen in this comic genre. And I think that's a deep insight into Spinoza. And I think that's also, something that the Parmenidean Ascent I'm trying to occupy there too. But this affirmation of being, it's in the comic genre. And that's why I put jokes throughout the book of various kinds, because I see my book as fitting into that perspective. But to see Spinoza in that light was very illuminating for me. It's one of the many insights that Dimitri's book contains, so it's very valuable. So I'll just stop there for now.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Dimitri, can I hold you to making maybe just 1 or 2 points in response?
Yes, I'd like to thank both Russ and Michael. In terms of Russ's presentation, I'm very grateful that you presented a kind of area that I don't really know anything about. I learned a lot from your presentation, and I look forward to your book very much and further discussions. And in terms of Michael and the 2 points that he raises about whether the primacy of practice over the Epicurean kind of assertion of the primacy of practice of a theory suggests a distinction. That's the first point. Okay, let me tongue-in-cheek say, I mean, this is the typical sort of deconstructive gesture, right? You know, Derrida would always say, oh, you know, you're making a distinction that is unwarranted, you know? And, you know, I'll grant you that. I'll completely grant you that I was not intending to make a distinction between theory and praxis. I was intending to suggest, when I was using the term primacy, and I was using it in order to describe that passage from the letter to Menoikos, which is in book 10, paragraph 132 of Diogenes Laertius. I was using it to describe that relation between phronesis and episteme, and to suggest that for Spinoza at least, there is a task of thinking and a task of acting. And that task consists in identifying the ways in which phronesis or practical knowledge goes wrong. So one of the key characteristics of the calculation of utility is its fallibility, it's the fact that it leads to errors. Okay? And you know, so to talk about the primacy of the practical is to say that from the perspective of practical philosophy, where we need to look first, not at what is true, but at what is wrong. So that's what I was meaning to suggest with that expression, not to suggest a distinction. In terms of teleology, one of the key points about, you know, talking about ends in the book, and the point that maybe I should have developed more, even though I do so in another book that I'm writing, is that there's a key distinction between, on the one hand, end understood in causal terms. So if you think of the Aristotelian theory of the four ends, you know, you have the material end, you know, the clay. You have the efficient end, the sculpture, you know. You have the formal end, the form that the clay will take, say a mug, you know. And you have the final end, where the mug is for, okay? So in terms of what I'm saying about phronesis does not concern that kind of final end that is usually referred to as teleology. It concerns rather, and you know, I've got a reading of various texts of antiquity where I try to prove that there is a kind of different notion of the end, where the end is provisional, it's not a final end, and which is linked with the thinking of means and ends in an instrumental kind of way, and it's critical of my argument that the final end and the instrumental end are distinct. So I don't see at all, like one of, you know, a kind of polemical point, if you want, within the sort of Spinoza literature, because I mean, it's, you know, given, say, the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics and so on and so forth, there is this kind of uniform agreement within Spinoza studies that, you know, Spinoza is anti-teleological. You know, he says, you know, to think of ends is the sanctuary of ignorance. That's, you know, from the appendix. Okay. Well, what I'm trying to say is to think of final ends is the sanctuary of ignorance from a human perspective, which lead us to that sort of fallibility of the provisional ends of phronesis. That is a kind of key part of the argument that I'm making. Anyway, these are some brief comments, but maybe, you know, we can open it up to questions from the floor, I was going to say, but from the screen, questions from the screen.
Thanks, Dimitri. Yeah, I'm keen to throw to the audience. So let me just remind everyone that if you'd like to ask a question, either write it in the chat function and I'll call on you, or you can just put a Q in the chat and I'll know to throw to you. But Miguel Vada has already indicated he has a question, so I'll hand it over to Miguel.
Thanks, Tristan. Yeah, the question is for Michael, and I'll premise that my understanding of ancient philosophy is totally amateurish, and furthermore, I have not read your book yet. So, but I wanted to go back and ask you really to hear what you think about the second part of the poem and its cosmology and astronomy there. And in particular, I just recently read Giorgio de Santillana's interpretation. I don't know if you're familiar with that, both in Hamlet's Mill and in an essay dedicated. He's a famous historian of science. And he makes a very interesting argument for how all the doxaic elements and mythical elements in the second part actually correspond to a very sophisticated astronomical and cosmological view. But he uses that to then point out that perhaps, going back to the first part, this being itself would be something like an isomorphic conception of space or the sphere, or something related to what Kant would call a pure intuition of space. So I was wondering where space would fit into your vision here. And the other, quickly, because I missed, I think, your discussion of the principle of sufficient reason. So I take it that principle has to do with, why something rather than nothing. Now, if your pure affirmation of being itself cannot really be distinguished, then there is no sense of distinction between something and nothing. So PSR wouldn't even begin to apply. Is that what you mean by throwing away the PSR with the latter, or did I miss something?
Good. Those are both really good questions about the space for Parmenides. So where would that fit in, right? He does say the one is a well-rounded sphere, and so there's lots of different ways to interpret that. So, but on the kind of view that I'm promoting, not necessarily as an interpreter of Parmenides, but space would be okay as long as it did not involve any kind of divisibility or distinctions or regions. And in fact, it's an interpretation of Spinoza, whereas the extension just is space, extension just is God, the extended substance under the attribute of extension. And God, of course, is indivisible. God has no distinction, so space would have no distinctions in itself. So I think there can be space as long as that the introduction of space doesn't bring with it any distinctions. About the PSR and distinguishing something from nothing, right? I think something and nothing approach each other at this point. It's hard to draw the distinction between them. But I do think that the view that I'm expressing is a pure positive affirmation of being as opposed to non-being. You might think that non-being doesn't involve distinction, so that would be as equally good as being, which I'm saying does not involve distinctions. But non-being is non-being. It's defined, as it were, in terms of what it's not. It's not being. So that kind of, the use of that negation there, that non-negated negation, introduce a kind of distinction that gives non-being a bad name, as it were. And so the view will be in favor of being as opposed to non-being.
Yeah, just very quickly, but then you're using negation in a way that you should not be using it to make the argument against non-being.
I have to climb the ladder and then kick it away. That's right.
Okay, we have a question from iPhone. I'm assuming that that's not their name, but if iPhone could unmute themselves and ask their question, that'd be great. Is iPhone still there? All right, I'll read the question.
Out.
So if creation, I assume this is for you, Michael. If creation ex nihilo is bunk, would our universe, which may exist because of the death of a previous universe, not an infinite regress, be coherent with Spinoza? I'm
not sure about Spinoza because I was expressing my own views there, but I just want to say that I do think that creation ex nihilo is to be rejected. And Dimitri Spinoza says the same thing, and I say that in my own voice. So that the antecedent of this question is satisfied. It's true. So would our universe be one in which may exist because of the previous universe be coherent with Spinoza, or with my view, no, it wouldn't be coherent, because there would be kind of a succession of universes or something like that, and that would involve distinctions, and so that would be one of the things that would go. Yeah.
Okay, and then Leonardo.
Sorry, can I add?
Yeah.
It would be coherent if it can be explainable under certain natural laws.
Yeah, but what's the status of those? Yeah, that's good. What's the status of those natural laws?
Well,
right? Yeah.
Okay, Leonardo, are you there?
I am. So first of all, thank you to the organizers and the speakers. This was really stimulating and fascinating topics. Wanted to say that. And I have a question for both presenters, but I'll just mention one and maybe hopefully get a few. And I'll ask Professor Vardoulakis, I guess, since he hasn't had any questions yet. So as somebody who is also loves finding Epicurean themes in Spinoza, I wanted to ask how far you think the Epicureanism goes in the moral philosophy in particular, because I think we can detect even in the TTP, not even going to the ethics, a particular kind of ethical perfectionism in Spinoza that might, I mean, I don't think so, but some might think resists sort of resists explanation in terms of sort of Epicurean themes. And in fact, in many cases, seems more redolent almost of Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, right? A sort of intellectualism that, deprioritizes phronesis, it seems, rather than stressing it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yes, I mean, I know the sort of strand of reading that you're referring to, and I'm completely opposed to it. I don't see Spinoza as being either an ethical or a political perfectionist, because there is there's not only the ethical perfectionism, also there's the political, various versions of political perfectionism. I don't know, like we need to educate the people so the people can have better voting rights and they do not vote Trump in anymore. Like that kind of, sometimes referred to as epistemic democracy or whatever, and similar kind of arguments about ethical perfectionism. I think Spinoza is completely non-involved in this kind of arguments, precisely for the point that's been raised several times here, about the importance of error and the importance of the fallibility of practical judgment in Spinoza. At least in my reading, that perfectionist reading, both in ethical and in political terms, is completely incompatible with my reading.
Given that no one else has indicated they have a question just now, I'm going to indulge myself and introduce a rather large question or topic for both Michael and Dimitri. So forgive me for this. What I'm worried is going to be a diatribe. But I'll start with Michael. So it seems to me that, Michael, the Parmenidean Ascent is a project. And to say that it's a project to move from making distinctions to seeing strict monism, as you call it, is kind of to say there's a journey involved. And I think Parmenides encourages this kind of understanding as well, in that his poem uses the term hodos, the road, the journey. But at the moment, as you presented it in the book, it looks like an individual project. But I think it's more correctly a collective project that's partly realized so far in your own ascent, in your own Parmenidean ascent, but actually needs to be more collectively realized. That is, that in your Parmenidean ascent, there is a whole set of collective circumstances, a material world that has enabled this. But all of those enabling conditions have kind of been presupposed or embedded implicitly within the project itself. And it seems to me that if we are to think about all those conditions that have realized that, we have to accept that a whole lot of distinctions have been made in that process, right? People have embraced distinctions that has produced the world that you live in, and that has allowed your Parmenidean ascent. Could we not say that if you want the Parmenidean ascent to be a collective project and not just an individual one, that perhaps there is a place to accept distinctions as necessary pragmatically to a Parmenidean ascent, including in your own life, but something which we actually then have to realize collectively if we want there to be a collective Parmenidean ascent. So that's the kind of approach to you. Relatedly, with Dimitri, something that struck me about your book is that you say right from the outset that the Epicurean approach presupposes totality. And it seems to me that in that move, you have also effaced the project or the journey that is required to get to the position where you can accept an Epicurean pragmatics, right? It seems to efface that you have to get to a point at which there is a presupposition of totality in order to accept practical reason or phronesis within Epicurean understanding. But what if instead of presupposing totality, we rather understood totality and an understanding of totality as something which actually has to be arrived at? Now, this, as I could leave it there, but let me just quickly say that I think there's a rejoinder to be made to Aristotle here. So in my own my own reading of Aristotle, I think that rather a little bit differently to the way that Dimitri portrays it in his book, there isn't quite just a simple priority of theory over phronesis. I think that Aristotle recognizes that phronesis is necessary in order to arrive at theory, and that process, that journey, is precisely a political one. And so I point as evidence of this to the etiology of the polis, the causal account of the polis in chapter 2 of book 1 of the Politics, where Aristotle begins with two human beings, a male and a female, who get together, and eventually this leads to the creation of the polis. And at the center of that account is the term kresis. And unfortunately, most translators since the 19th century have translated kresis as need, necessities, but kresis in Greek means use. And so what I see Aristotle as pointing to, in a very minimalistic sense, which I think can be explained, in a very minimalistic sense, he's pointing to the use of humans as a project which unfolds, that creates the polis, and in Aristotle's understanding of nature, for the most part, right? So there is fallibility there. It creates the polis for the most part, because that's how Aristotle understands nature. And in doing so, in realizing the polis, it realizes the conditions for theory. And then to return to you guys, if that's the account, then this is the collective project which needs to take place in order for us to accept some of the fundamental ideas that you're pointing to, whether the presupposition of totality and therefore the phronesis, the practical philosophy that Spinoza is pointing to, or Epicureanism is pointing to, or the Parmenidean Ascent as Michael understands it.
I'll say something very brief. Thanks for that question, Tristan, which encompasses everything that Dimitri and I said in our two books. It's really a great way of putting them together and asking the same question from different perspectives, same challenging question. Yes, this is a collective project. And yes, of course, there are many conditions that made possible my writing the book and my own personal journey in the Parmenidean Ascent. And I've not gone very far in my own journey. I need help. I need all the help I can get. In some ways, the book is a cry for help in some ways, and that I need help in this project. Is there room for me to recognize all the differences, the relations that made this kind of project possible? Yes, but that's what I said at the end. Once you make the Parmenidean Ascent, you can go back to what which we said previously, invoke the distinctions you invoked before, but no longer with the realist metaphysical significance that you normally endow distinctions with. So yes, I can talk about distinctions, I can talk about the conditions that made this possible, but investing none of it with the metaphysical significance and the problems that realist metaphysics gets into. So that's part of the project. How to carry that out, of course, that needs to be seen at how to carry it out. And that gets to some of Dimitris's challenges to me too. What kind of action, philosophy of action, is possible by the Parmenidean Ascent? It's really the same kind of question you're asking here. I think it's exactly the right point to push me on, because that's what happens after I kick away the Latin and make the Parmenidean Ascent. That's the project from now on, yes.
Thanks.
Yes, Tristan, these were excellent questions, and so thank you so much for that. Regarding the totality, I mean, the way I put it, and I mean, I put it with reference to the beginning of the letter to Herodotus, which is the first of the 3 letters that Diogenes Laertius reproduces in whole in his Lives of Philosophers, letter from Epicurus, right? The way I put it is that there is a totality outside of which nothing exists, okay? Which is not simply a totality, you know. It's a totality understood in monist terms, and I take this to be a synonym with the idea that there is no creation ex nihilo, which is a much later way of putting it, even though that there is no being ex tu midenos, out of nothing, is the way that Democritus and Epicurus and other people put it, you know. So I think, okay, your question is complicated because, in a sense, I want to say that I want to have it both as a presupposition that totality understood in these monist terms, and to be able to say that it can be arrived at for the following reason. I want to have it as a presupposition because it seems to me that the entire ancient Greek philosophy presupposes a non-creationist kind of ontology or cosmology, if you want. I'm not aware of an example from ancient Greek philosophy that does not do that. So, in the letter to Herodotus specifically, is presented as a presupposition. It's not a point that is argued at. So, from that perspective, I want to say that historically, in a sort of pre-Christian world, that sort of monism of a totality outside of which nothing exists is presupposed. Now, if you turn into a world that is already gone through Christian metaphysics, or whatever you want to call it, a kind of creationist metaphysics, then yes, I mean, that totality needs to be proved, if you want, or it needs to be arrived at. And that's what Spinoza does in book 1 of the Ethics. So I want to be able to say both that it can be presupposed in the pre-Christian metaphysics and that it needs to be arrived at in a kind of a way that shows its kind of opposition to Christian metaphysics. And when I mentioned at the beginning, when I was doing the sort of presentation of you know, the sort of summary of my book, the importance of Michael's book, when I think it was published in 2007 or something like that, or maybe 2006, something like that. You know, it was at the beginning when I was getting into Spinoza, and you know, it just showed me, like, it has some kind of excellent readings of part 1 of the Ethics, and how we can arrive at monism, a sort of Spinozan kind of moving towards monism. That was why Michael's book was very important for me, but I want to have both. As for the relation between theory and praxis and phronese and episteme, I do not want to suggest at all that there is separation between theory and praxis in Aristotle. That is very clear from the end of book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. The Sophia is more important for knowledge than phronesis, but he also says, and I'm quoting, that phronesis is the schirotera, which means it has more power, is more impactful, is more utilious, if you want, than Sophia. Okay? So it's not a simple relation of, oh yeah, you know, one trumps the other or something like that. You know, the two are connected, but the clear Aristotelian kind of direction is that Sophia is more important than phronesis, and that's what I was trying to sort of capture there.
Thanks, Dimitri. Unfortunately, Russ has had to run, but Miguel has, I think, probably our final question for Dimitri.
I do. It's too bad that he left because, I mean, Dimitris knows what's coming, because I sort of disagree, and we've spoken about this, about the Epicureanism of Spinoza, but I was very struck by what Russ said. It was Geller's formula, and he kept insisting love of God above all else, and then, you know, charis, filial love, and so on, friendliness. So, you know, how do you make sense in Epicurean terms of this love of God above all else? And in fact, even how do you make Epicurean sense of something like intellectual love of God in Spinoza? I'm not even sure these two things are exactly the same, but they seem in both cases to be really, I would think, very difficult to have an Epicurean understanding of them.
Yeah, I mean, God is a misnomer in Spinoza in many ways. I mean, I love that sort of passage in Althusser, where he says, oh, you know, why does he, you know, people ask me why Spinoza bothers talking about God, and he says, well, because if you want to be able to conquer a castle, you know, you set it up on the top of the hill in order to be able to sack it, you know, like, you know, and that's what he does, he says, with God. But I mean, if we understand God simply as a totality outside of which nothing exists, which is the definition of substance, then I don't think it's difficult to reconcile Epicureanism, or for that matter, any pre-creationist metaphysics with Spinoza's God. So that's the sort of short answer, if you want, you know, like it is the sort of pre-creationist ontology that the name God in Spinoza, in a completely paradoxical way, of course, is the referent to.
Okay, Leonardo's signaled he's got one more question, so we'll make that the final one.
Sorry, I don't want to keep anyone here, but I couldn't help myself. So I did have a question for Professor Della Rocca about basically just inviting him to say a little more about how, since you pitch the book in part as a criticism of the practice of philosophy, right? Yeah. How you would envision philosophy being practiced sort of in an ameliorated way. And in particular, since you know, you invoked Wittgenstein during your talk, I found it interesting because Wittgenstein pitches his project, right, in some sense as the end of philosophy, right, as sort of quietism. We're not supposed to be doing philosophy anymore. And so I just wanted to, you know, hear if you had any thoughts about, you know, what philosophy should be like in light of this.
I make two suggestions near the very end of the book, and this is guided by my rationalism, which will point me in a different direction, I think, from Wittgenstein. One is that to look to the history of philosophy, because there's what I call the Iron Curtain of intuitions, which has descended upon much of analytic philosophy, starting in the 20th century into the present. So the more we look towards the history of philosophy for how philosophy was done before that the Iron Curtain of intuitions descended, I think that would be good. And so it's a plea for the study of the history of philosophy. And another way is to take, for philosophy going forward, is to take very seriously the PSR, see where it leads, and not to dismiss it out of hand, as most philosophers do nowadays, is to dismiss the PSR. So using, studying the history of philosophy and prosecuting going forward with the PSR as far as it will go, those would be two suggestions for philosophy going forward, because I don't think there's an end to philosophy. I don't think philosophy can end as long as there's going to human inquiry. There's going to be philosophy, but I think it's in our interest to not conduct philosophy in this kind of blinkered way that it sometimes falls into.
Within the first of reading the first few pages of Michael's book, I realized just how radical it seemed to be. So I want to wholeheartedly endorse Dimitri's comments before, which I was happy to hear because I didn't feel confident to say them earlier. But now that Dimitri said it, I do feel emboldened to reiterate them. I really loved Michael's radicality and made it very apt for this forum. And I wholeheartedly agree with Russ that Dimitri's reading of Spinoza through Epicureanism opens up all these new pathways for interpretation. And I'm happy to also see another political theoretical approach to use and utility, which is my own thing. But thanks for not making Aristotle the hero, Dimitri, because that's my project. So thanks so much to you guys. This has been really fantastic for me, and we hope that you're able to keep these conversations going. And to the audience, thanks for your patience, and I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody,
André,
very much
for your comments.
A lot.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.